It's my pleasure today to welcome everyone who is attending. This discussion comes at a time when jobs of all types are being disrupted, and the impact on women seems to be particularly harsh in a lot of ways, not least because of their unpaid care responsibilities, which are suddenly intensified because of school closure, movement restrictions, the increased health risks of some family members that they may be facing. And paid work is becoming much harder to balance as well. In a lot of cases, paid work hasn't even been possible, which of course brings in a whole additional range of very severe problems and sources of stress for families and for women. Today, we're talking specifically about women working in the digital economy, the type of gig work that's mediated through digital platforms. This can mean quite a few things, and it's important to be specific, I think, about the different kinds of work. We'll be hearing mostly about women entrepreneurs who use platforms to sell goods, and women who use on-demand platforms to provide services. There are also platforms where workers provide more sort of knowledge-based services that can be done from home or anywhere in the world. But these are the generally, these are the types of platforms, I guess, that we're talking about the most. These are all really quite different, and what's common is what they can offer, which is the flexibility to work on your own hours, your own time, in some cases, the ability to set your own rate, but that's not common across all platforms. And normally it comes with the ability to choose work locations, either at home or close to home in a radius where workers might feel more comfortable. So this can be really promising, particularly for women who we know always have to balance unpaid care work, as well as in many cases restrictive norms. But this kind of work doesn't always live up to expectations. The work often mirrors, many types of this work often mirrors informal work, leaving workers outside of formal social security and social protection systems, something that COVID has absolutely highlighted. And many of the kinds of formal workplace benefits are not available to platform workers either, for example, maternity leave or sick leave. The trade-offs offered to workers are important to understand, and so are the roles of everyone else involved in the platform economy. So the enterprises themselves, policymakers and government infrastructure, consumers, and the way that all of these interact to shift risks around in a new way. And I don't think we know enough about all of that yet, and particularly how it's playing out among low-income workers and in low and middle-income countries more generally. We need more data and evidence on ways that women are interacting with the platform economy directly, indirectly, the choices that they're able to make within the platform structures, and the balance between online and offline work, as well as with unpaid care work, and other factors that can facilitate or prevent women from finding decent opportunities through digital spaces. So the IDRC is supporting a cohort of research projects called Women Work in the Gig Economy that look at how women are engaging with digital platforms and how those platforms can enhance women's economic empowerment and build more gender inclusive opportunities in lower income contexts. The researchers are looking at challenges women face in accessing and benefiting from work through digital platforms, the kinds of practices and platform models that may create better opportunities or better quality, more inclusive work, and to design and scale solutions that improve the quality of work in collaboration with workers, online enterprises, and policymakers. The projects are looking across 7 countries in South and Southeast Asia, and there are many partners involved, including the Just Jobs Network and IHS, who are both going to be represented on this panel. And I hope a number of other partners are online as well and can come in maybe during the discussion to offer perspectives from their own work and their own different contexts. This group of projects are all in their early phases. They began just before COVID hit, but actually I think that this has presented an opportunity, the opportunity for the research and the findings then to reflect the challenges that have been exposed in this crisis. So today's discussion will help us, and I hope everybody online, to think about those kinds of disruptions. The panelists all have really different perspectives to offer, including entrepreneurs who've been using platforms to sell goods. And so I'm really looking forward to hear from all of them. So with that, I'm going to turn it back to Sabina now to tell you a little bit more and guide this discussion. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you very much, Jillian. Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you all for being here. We're really happy to see so many of you join us. I, of course, want to start by thanking IDRC. As Jillian mentioned, IDRC has basically supporting this consortium of researchers from around the world that are looking into this very important issue of women work and the gig economy. And several of our consortium members are part of this call. Of course, Aditi Suri will be presenting. The Just Jobs Network also has a project that specifically looks at home-based work for women, home-based gig work for women in Cambodia, Myanmar, and Thailand. And we have participants from CPR, Learn Asia, IIHS, several of our consortium partners that are also heading research projects looking at various aspects of women work in the gig economy. I especially want to start by thanking Etsy as well, who Himanshu Vardhan is on this call. He's the country director of Etsy India, and Himanshu has been instrumental in helping us sort of get access to the voices of some of the sellers on Etsy, which we'll be hearing from today. So the idea of this particular webinar, there's been a lot of different webinars that have been done looking at the specific challenges that women face in the gig economy. And what we wanted to do with this particular webinar was really look at a diverse set of voices, and to the extent that we can, try to bring in some of the stories of women themselves. A lot of studies look at, women that come from different, some lower socioeconomic backgrounds, but the fact of the matter is that women in all socioeconomic groups across various cultural and political contexts all share a unique set of challenges, ranging from patriarchy and sexism to the challenge of balancing your professional life with the obligations of domestic work, of maternity, of motherhood, also balancing the security concerns that women face. These are challenges that are unique to women, but they're not unique to women of any one group. They're unique to all women everywhere, from different socioeconomic groups, from different political and cultural backgrounds. And so the idea today was to really try to think through what some of the challenges confronting women in several different groups are, and confronting women that want to come into the gig economy or that are in the gig economy in various capacities. What are their experiences, and in particular, how is COVID, how is the COVID crisis affecting them? I just also would like to contextualize this discussion into the context of India right now, which we know has already a very low and declining female labor force participation rate. Less than 1 in 4 women are in the labor market. Disproportionately, women are employed in the informal sector and informal employment with low value-added jobs. Their economic mobility is limited. And even within regular wage workers, 66% of women in India among regular wage workers have no contract, half have no paid leave, and half have no social security. So, I think what COVID is doing, as Jillian rightly said, COVID has exposed several of these challenges and lifted them up for our consideration. And I think it's also accelerating some of these vulnerabilities that women already face. And so with that, I want to, turn to our really excellent panel that I think bring a diversity of views on the issue of women work in the gig economy. I will just go ahead and introduce them all up front, and then we will hear from them in the course of the discussion. So first, I'd like to introduce Himanshu Vardhan, who is a technology executive and entrepreneur with experience of building and leading businesses in India and the United States. Currently, Himanshu is the managing director for Etsy in India, where he is heading the India business. His key focus is mobilizing and empowering the creative community in India and connecting micro-entrepreneurs from different parts of the country to the world through the Etsy platform. So thank you so much for joining us and for Etsy's partnership throughout this webinar, Himanshu. Next, I'd also like to introduce Aditi Suri, who is a sociologist who researches and teaches at the India Institute for Human Settlements. She is interested in the forces that make, bend, and breed business models in the digital economy, and how they impact the bodies how they impact labor on platforms. Her research is situated within larger questions of urban development and city economies. And just on a personal note, I work a lot in the area of digital economy and the gig economy and platforms. And Aditi is really one of the very informed voices, one of the informed researchers in this space. So do look out for her work. Next, I'd like to introduce Funda Ustek-Spilda, who is a postdoctoral researcher at the Fair Work Foundation based at the Oxford Internet Institute at the University of Oxford. She studies ethics, justice, and fairness in emerging technologies with a focus on gender, labor, and migration. At Fair Work, she leads the project on COVID-19 responses of the platforms to protect workers' health and safety. And if you haven't looked at the excellent work the Fair Work Foundation does, I would suggest that our viewers look that up right after this webinar. They do some groundbreaking work, including indexing of platforms on their employment practices. And finally, last but not least, I would like to introduce Kriti Jindal, who has studied apparel management and merchandising at the Pearl Academy of Fashion in New Delhi. She worked as a buyer and a merchandiser with some of the largest retailers in the industry before starting her own venture, Kari by Kriti, in 2014. And she is one of our spotlight voices for this webinar because Kriti has a wonderful story and an extraordinary story of strength and enterprise that she'll be sharing with us today, and we'll be hearing from her in just a little bit. So without further ado, let me turn to my panelists. If I could please request all of our listeners to mute your lines so that only our panelists have their lines open. And also if everybody except for the three panelists, Himanshu, Aditi, and Funda, if everyone else could please turn your cameras off just for now so that we have the spotlight on our three panelists. So I want to start by just a general framing question, and Himanshu, will start with you, and then we'll go to Funda and then Aditi. What do you perceive to be the most salient impacts of COVID-19 on A, the gig economy, and second, on women in the gig economy? So the idea is, first, I want to just hear from you on where do you think the gig economy is headed now? And second, how do you think this is going to impact women in the gig economy? So thank you again and welcome. And as our speakers are presenting, if any of the participants would like to type questions into the chat session, please feel free to do so. And we'll pick them up, as many of them as possible, in our question and answer session a little bit later on. Thank you. So we'll start with Himanshu.
Hi, good afternoon. Thanks a lot, Sabina and Just Shop Networks for having me over today. Nice Sunday afternoon, a little warm, but really excited to be talking to everybody on this topic. It's kind of interesting that obviously during these situations, focus on working from home or working remotely has obviously there has been a lot of focus now, but as just as a pretext to what Etsy is, and in terms of our participants of sellers who sell on Etsy, there's a very helpful context that will also sort of contextualize the current situation in terms of how this might impact sellers that are similar to Etsy sellers, and then Kriti can add on more to it. Globally, we have about, Etsy has about 2.5 million sellers. These are creative entrepreneurs. Most of them are not traditional sellers or businesses. They are 87% of them are women, and 97% of them are home-based sellers. So even irrespective of this particular situation, India Etsy has always had a lot of participation from women, and a large participation comes from women who are based out of their homes and making stuff. Um, so with that context, um, I actually feel that a lot of this is going to create a level playing field for people who have been operating from home or remotely for a long time. And in terms of, in general, the gig economy workers, obviously there's going to be two categories of them. One category of them that are anyways operating remotely, and they would of course they would definitely be benefited, because it puts them at a level playing field with a lot of other people who are working in office settings in usual circumstances, now working from home as well. While there are other category of gig economy workers that need to be there, on the ground to do their role, whether it's people who are delivering products or services, in and it requires for them to be physically present. Obviously, I think that part of the economy might be impacted in another way. I do feel that this is largely going to be give a very good level playing field to home-based sellers and to women who've been working from home as freelancers or making these products and creating small businesses, and this could potentially be sort of an interesting kind of turning point of some sort. However, obviously, people who are involved in more gig economy where they need to be physically present, it might be a little bit of a disruption for them.
Great. Thank you for those thoughts. Funda, would you like to go next?
Sure. First of all, thank you everyone, and thank you to Just Jobs Network for organizing this webinar. So at Fair Work, we have been studying the responses from platforms in terms of what kind of policies and measures they rolled out to protect the health and safety of the workers during the COVID crisis. But perhaps I should clarify that we are only studying for this project. We're only studying location-based platforms, so it's a bit different than Etsy. So it's ride-hailing platforms, delivery workers, domestic workers, beauty or personal grooming services, where the workers need to be in the places where the work happens, basically. And we have studied 120 platforms across 23 countries for the first report. And now we're going to release a second report with the updated measures from the platforms, and also increase the number of countries and the platforms that we have studied. And the reason for this is we were first seeking to understand what kind of measures the platforms were rolling out in the midst of the pandemic. But now we are entering a second stage, as many countries across the world are easing their COVID-19 measures or the lockdown measures. And we would like to see what kind of practices, what kind of measures will continue with the platforms, and which ones are going to be rolled back. So this second report will be available at the end of July. And gender, although it wasn't one of the specific focus points of the report, we of course looked into platforms, what was happening to platforms that are predominantly where women are the majority of the workers, such as domestic work and personal grooming services and beauty services platforms or massage services. And what we have seen is that the activity stopped. And that's one of the policy points that we've been trying to sort of throw out, that platforms rarely roll out policies that include the family members of the workers, which disproportionately affect women workers if they are burdened, or if they are the people who would have to take care of their children, their elderly parents, or the sick in the family. And if they do not get that kind of help or measure from the platforms, then it also affects their ability to continue working during the pandemic. I'll speak more, but this is the general introduction to Fireworks ongoing COVID work.
Great. Thank you so much, Funda. And Aditi, for your perspective?
Sure. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. Again, I just want to start by saying thank you to Sabina and Stefan at the Just Jobs Network and Jillian at IDRC for bringing us all together. And I really appreciate the fact that this panel has a mix of people who actively use the platform model, who run marketplaces, and then those of us who study and reflect on their outcomes. I think the pandemic, lockdown, and the economic disruptions that it's brought on, along with how we've had to change our ability to use physical space, is really a key time to look at what platforms do, how they behave, and people who depend on them fare. Because the COVID disruptions have been an extremely strong force in the digitalization of many parts of economic activity, forcing consumers, workers, service providers, sellers, all of us in our various economic roles that we take on to depend on the internet. So having platform operators, the same conversation is really key to trying to shape a future that can take some of our insights from our research and reflect these back into business practices, hopefully at some point. And this is the kind of approach that we're looking to take in a new project that we're doing that Jillian and Sabina briefly spoke about. And I'm part of a larger project that's trying to see how public policy and platform ecosystems can work together to make women's economic empowerment a central role to how platform companies work in. And this is a project with partners in Sri Lanka, Learn Asia in New Delhi at the Center for Policy Research and the World Resources Institute. Just to kind of clue in more strictly to the question you asked, Sabina, the first things I thought about was if I'm looking at global data and Indian numbers, we find that women tend to work online in similar sectors to where they work offline. So there's no structural shift that platforms have caused in women's labor force participation so far as we can see, though the data is of course quite weak. And some of the largest companies we have in India, the largest platform companies, don't have any real representation of women either. So women who engage on platforms in on-demand services like the platforms that Funda was talking about, on-demand services, are extremely low. So last year, a report came out that cited 96% of the workforce on on-demand platforms in India is male. So if we think about the relationship between COVID and the gig economy, it needs to have a kind of larger way of unpacking, like even how to get into looking at what that is. What we do know is that because of the COVID-19 restrictions, household incomes have significantly suffered, right? So where women's income is often in India seen as supplementary to a central household income by men, because women's work comes from flexible work, non-permanent work, it's become more important now than ever before, and in the kind of midterm coming up in the next year or so. This means that the COVID crisis has forefronted just how central their incomes are. So the platforms that women do work on tend to take women's work as flexible as supplementary. And I did notice that I think on some of the Etsy pages, when you sign up as a seller, they very clearly ask you, are you doing this full time? Are you doing this as a part-time thing? I think because of this economic disruption, we have to start paying more attention to the fact that these incomes are very central to households, and basic payment in houses are done through this income. So there needs to be a lot more done to kind of regulate and stabilize that. And how platforms have played a role in this really differ. And I'm going to take two short examples and end. So the first is, by a company, an example of a company called Meesho, which is a small reseller marketplace that's mostly popular in Tier 2 and Tier 3 small towns in India, not so much in our metros. And it's a marketplace which kind of allows women to use their kind of small social networks to resell goods that are made by other people. And what this platform did was, when they saw the restrictions on physical movement and retail taking place, they pivoted their offerings, as many other platforms have, to e-offerings, telemedicine, online education, e-tutoring, reselling grocery services. And what this did for the women who depend on Meesho was give them an option to earn some kind of an income, right? Not a very stable income, but some kind of an income to make sure that their supplementary income was still coming into the household. At the same, and this is what platforms really are good for. They're agile entities. They're able to switch and move the kind of service offerings they have. And that's really a powerful thing to keep in mind as we think about what COVID has done to the economy. At the same time, this agility comes at the cost of other things. So we've seen where in a lot of low-skill work, like domestic work in India, domestic workers unions have played a very strong role in bringing women workers to have better access to state programs and state social protection and state emergency protections that have been made available to them. And the role of any platform in doing this is really not been studied, and I don't think too many platforms have done this. So I think to just keep in mind that platforms can be very agile and help women in building income, but also at the same time, there is always a go-between that's required, because a lot of women don't have often the time because of their care burdens to interface with the platform companies and the state. So I'm just going to leave it at that.
Great. Thank you so much for that, Aditi. So I think it's very interesting that, I think starting with some of the key points that Aditi raised, I think understanding the different kinds of business models that platforms deploy, which makes them more adaptable, more agile to a pandemic situation, and how we see sort of the gig economy and platforms in some ways being able to better cope than some of the other sectors and brick and mortar businesses that are being affected by COVID. And within that, I think it's also very interesting to think about how platforms do or do not contribute to the structural transformation that everybody is talking about, whether platforms actually facilitate a harnessing of the productive potential of workers, and particularly what is the place of women in that. If women tend to work in the sectors where they already are, then in some sense platforms aren't really improving productivity or necessarily contributing to the structural transformation. And I think in this respect, Funda, I'm going to come back to you in a little bit for you to elaborate a little bit more on what are some of the measures that you see platforms taking. So if they are more agile, what are they exactly doing in order to both adapt their business models, but also adapt the ability and the resilience of their service providers in this context? And of course, from Himanshu, I think we got really valuable information about the kind of the diversity of women that participate in the gig economy and the diversity of activities that they undertake. And in some ways, to pick up off of Himanshu's points, that platforms can level the playing field by allowing women to work on their own terms and give them access to new markets. So to kind of shed a little bit more light on women working on their own terms, I'd like to bring in our next panelist, Kriti, who is an Etsy entrepreneur. Kriti, great to have you. Thank you so much for your willingness to come and share your story.
Thank you so much for having me, Sabina.
Thank you. I would love for you, Kriti, to please share sort of what is what is your experience? How did you become an Etsy entrepreneur? And then to talk a little bit more about sort of how your business is faring in this sort of post-COVID. Actually, we're not past it. So during the COVID pandemic, what are some of the challenges that you've been facing, and what your journey? So what has your journey been? What the current state of affairs is? And then I'd love for you to extrapolate some thoughts and lessons for women entrepreneurs more broadly. So over to you, Kriti.
Thank you, Sabina. So I started Kari by Kriti in 2014. And how I started was, it was, I would say it was luck, and it was by chance. And so basically what happened was, I have a background in textiles. I studied apparel merchandising. And I was working with, a couple of retailers. So I worked with Carrefour France. And then I worked for William E. Connor, Pottery Barn. And I was buying and merchandising for these retailers here in India. And in 2012, my husband and I, we moved to Sydney in Australia. And there I was working again as a, a sourcing manager. But just 2 months into my job, I met with a small accident. It was a freak accident. But I kind of it was quite bad. So I fractured my ankle in multiple places, and I was I was asked to not step out of the house for 6 months. So I underwent 2 surgeries, and then I was put on rest, so as to say. And during that time, I actually lost that job. So it wasn't a job, sourcing jobs aren't really something that you can do from home. So I actually had to give up on that job, and I really had nothing to do. So it was kind of depressing, and that's when my husband actually, he kind of motivated me to do something of my own. And since I had a textiles background, I started to write a blog, and I had a blog. I used to share stories of entrepreneurs, small businesses, women from around the world, in Australia, who were doing these small things from home. And that's when I got to know about Etsy. And this was 2012, 2013. So Etsy was fairly new at that point of time. So in 2013, we came back to India, and I was just so inspired by these, people I had interviewed over my blog and, met, that I decided that I'm not going to go back to a full-time job, but I will set up something of my own. So that's when, I decided to pursue my own business, and I set up Kari by Kriti, and I started it with I designed 2 little baby quilts, and I put them up on Etsy, and I had like a great response from there. And then from then on, I did 10 quilts, and then those also sold off. And then, then I decided that I would do a larger collection with, maybe larger quilts. So that's when I asked my husband, I said, I have this really awesome business idea. Would you like to invest? And he said, I would definitely love to invest. Please show me the business plan. And I almost looked at him like, I married you. How can you ask me for a business plan? So that's when he said that if you have to be a business, you must have a business plan, and you should really put things down on paper. And that's when in 2014 I actually went back online on my Excel, opened my computer. I had not seen Excel in years. And I put things down on, I calculated stuff. I put on my margins, I put down my goals. And I think from then on, my business, as I should say, it has been steadily improving. I think what happened in the last 2 months, Sabina, is something, so March and April, I think almost all over the world, we went into a lockdown sort of a situation. And for me, I design home textiles, and I think that is that that period of, April, half of March, April, half of May was extremely, it was amazing for me as an Etsy seller. I think my sales grew from I think over 700% from compared to last year same time. And I think that is because a lot of people moved into a very home sort of a situation, and suddenly people wanted curtains, and suddenly people wanted to change their bedding and things like that. And that is what really, my business boomed at that point of time. And while I was really, really happy and very grateful for the, opportunity, the thing was that it meant that I could not replenish my stock because everything was shut down. So now, while we're still in the middle of it, and things have started to open up, I still do not have a lot of stock ready because we went into this lockdown situation and nothing was working. So I actually source a lot of my textiles from Jaipur, and logistics is in complete chaos. So so I think the repercussions of those 2 months, even though at that point of time I was having good sales, I am going to see those roll over into the next few months, or into the into the festive season going forward. I think that's the COVID situation for me, and a little bit about myself. And over to you, Sabina.
Great. Thank you. Thank you so much for that, Kriti. Do you, before I let you go, Kriti, let me ask you quickly, how do you see, I mean, you kind of had a partnership with your husband who kind of prompted you to put together a business plan.
Yeah.
How do you think other women fare? And how do you think, in general, in terms of entrepreneurship is risky, entrepreneurship is not easy, and it's not for everybody. And so, I mean, how has that journey been for you, and how do you think it is for other women who may or may not have the kind of support that you did?
I think, Sabina, the gig economy, as we call it, or the freelance work, really doesn't have a lot of societal acceptance, I would say, at this point of time in India, because it's really not accepted as real work, So for a lot of people, what I do is, they would call it a hobby, and it becomes very difficult for me to explain that, no, this is real work for me. This is something I do for a living. And the money I get is being added into the household kitty. But and I think it's the similar situation for a lot of women in my position, that a lot of us, it's very difficult to justify what we do. So there are a lot of times when people have come up to me and asked me that, when do you plan to go back to a full-time job? And I'm like, the work that I do is more than full-time. I'm almost working all through the day on this. So I think that is one thing that we really need to appreciate, people who are doing this sort of a work, because a lot of it goes into it. It's not just a hobby or something that you do in your pastime, right? And then I think the other thing with women in the gig economy is really that there's a lot of self-doubt. So when there's money involved, and maybe you're not initially making a lot out of it, you've spent some money into getting stuff done, but you're not able to sell it. There's a lot of pressure on you, and I think from the family on how to kind of monetize what you've set out to do. So that is, I think, one thing. I think that is that. The other thing which I think a lot of women face, especially in the freelance economy, is really trying to find that balance between being creative, and also managing the finances. So, because freelance work means that for a lot of us, that you do the work and then you get the money. So how do I really make a financial plan out of it? What can I do with the money? How can I invest it further? Or really, what are the government regulations that can help me? I mean, there's nothing really clear about it. Like, I don't know where I can go and find a end-to-end solution to a GST issue. Like, do I really need a GST? things like that, that is, so these regulations, I think these things, I can be creative all the time, but when it comes to managing these things, I do need help. And I think that is what a lot, those are the kind of challenges a lot of women like me face here.
Do you feel like you have resources that help you sort of get information on changing regulations or explain GST, or help with financial literacy? For
Absolutely nothing. Absolutely nothing. I don't think I don't think I know anyone I can approach, to solve. I do have a chartered accountant who works for my, my husband's returns, and she does them for me also. But, even I don't have anywhere to really go and find out that why do I need a GST, or what do I need an IEC code for? What should I do with the IEC code after I get one? So I don't think there's one real platform where I can find out that, okay, if I am a freelancer, these are the things I need, and this is where I can, apply for it, and this is why I need them. And even with GST, like, things like you need to file a GST return every month. But what do you file really? Like, I have no idea.
I have to say, Kriti, I'm not a gig worker, but I also run my own think tank, my own business, and it is hard. It's very hard, and I mean, I'm smiling because I 100% relate to you in terms of, having to learn every day how to manage the different kinds of changing regulations, the legal obligations, the HR obligations of running a business, the financial aspects of it. And so I fully agree with you. Thank you so much for adding so much to this discussion, and we'll come back to you in the question and answer session again.
Absolutely. Thank you
So much, Kriti. So now I actually want to turn to you, Funda, really quickly to, we're getting a lot of questions in the chat box. So I wanted to ask you, can you elaborate a little bit more on sort of what insights does Fair Work Foundation's research give on how platforms accommodate the needs of female gig workers, particularly during the crisis? And more broadly, have you seen cloud work platforms in particular respond in a way that's different than the norm to the COVID crisis? Have they made any changes to their policies as a result of the crisis? And how do these particularly affect women workers? If you could talk about your research more generally and then extrapolate some lessons on what your thoughts are on the impact on women workers, that would be great. Thanks.
Sure. So I'll actually answer the question about cloud work separately than location-based work, because the platforms are different, the way they operate are different, and their business models are very different as well as the global outreach. So our study was entirely based on location-based work, and the reason is not because we haven't observed any changes in cloud work. It's just it was already very difficult to do a study on cloud work during pandemic, and on location-based work, and how the workers are impacted during the pandemic, because it was we didn't get a chance to talk to the workers, for instance. So our report is based entirely on the policies we could find on the websites of the platforms, as well as online research based on journalist accounts and who have been able to talk to the workers. We have another COVID report for South Africa where we were able to talk to and survey some workers there. So that gives some insights to us. And we have also spoken to some workers in India with thanks to our local team who are based there. But with cloud work, this was not really possible. The kind of changes we have seen in cloud work platforms were also a little different than the location-based platforms. So we know, for instance, some platforms restricted new users or newcomers to the platforms to be able to continue offering work to the people who are already registered on their platform. So that was one of the change, and it indicates that there was a heightened interest in participating in cloud work platforms. But it's very difficult to determine whether or not the people who signed up to cloud work platforms are going to continue seeking jobs from these platforms, or are, once they can go back to their usual occupations or usual practices, if they will stay on cloud work part-time. So this is really difficult to know, because the data when it comes to gig economy is very uncertain and very volatile. So it's hard to pinpoint the reasons and the outcomes and the directionality of them, basically. But when it comes to location-based work and cloud work, there's definitely one common point, and that's in none of the platforms we have observed any specific policy that targeted women workers, and that includes even the platforms where the majority of workers are women. So this is definitely a one major finding, even though it's a lack of finding, it looks like it, and that's because I think it is impossible to overlook how women have been particularly disadvantaged during the crisis and during whether or not they can continue their work during the pandemic due to their heightened care work or care needs. In terms of the kind of measures we have observed that the platforms have undertaken, and this is about the location-based platforms, we have organized this across 5 principles. So just to give a bit of a background about Fair Work, we are a research group, but we rate platforms according to 5 principles of Fair Work. And this is fair pay, fair conditions, fair contracts, fair management, and fair representation. So we organized all the policies and the measures that we've found during our research across and to match these principles, and whether or not the kind of measures taken about pay indicated fair pay practices, or the measures that were taken for changes to contracts or changes to the conditions indicated fair working practices. So majority of the measures we have observed were related to basically the conditions. And I know, I'm pretty sure everyone has heard about the contact-free delivery service now. It's so popular across the world. So that was basically the most popular policy that we have found across all platforms. And another thing was rolling out of sort of PPE, personal protective equipment, say sort of masks, gels, disinfectant gels, or facilities for workers to be able to wash their hands. But the effectiveness of, or the actual reach of these policies, when we listened to workers, were very patchy. And what I mean by this is that some platforms said they would give disinfectants, but that required workers to go to centers that were really far from them, and that exposed them to other risks. Some said they would be reimbursed, but the reimbursement process was so long that the workers ended up not being reimbursed. And similarly with sort of contact-free delivery service, we see that it's not always possible. In some countries, cash is still the king, so consumers still prefer to pay by cash, and that increases the risk workers are exposed to. But as you see with all of these sort of common policies that the platforms rolled out, they are not specifically targeting any gender group, but they are targeting more male workers because they are the majority in these types of jobs. But we have also seen good policies, so we need to stress those as well. And these are basically platforms rolling out financial assistance to the workers, even though they're unable to work. And even though this was not very common, across the 120 platforms that we surveyed, we have found only 5 platforms doing this. But it was increasingly important because not many workers could continue to working, either because they needed to self-isolate because they were taking care of vulnerable family members, or they themselves were vulnerable, or their platforms couldn't operate because of the lockdown measures. And this mainly implicates women workers because they work in services which are difficult to continue if there are sort of social distancing measures in place. So, hairdressers, personal grooming services, beauty services, massage services, domestic work, these kind of jobs became really difficult to carry out, and this implicated the women. There was one question about discrimination. Yes. So whether do we see from Saloni, do we see evidence of platforms in the services space reinforcing various gender discriminations, more so during COVID? I think it's very difficult to answer this question because, again, the reasons and the outcomes and the directionality of it is very difficult to pinpoint. It's really difficult to say whether the platforms are reinforcing the established gender roles, or the families of the women workers expect women to perform in a certain way during the pandemic that they can't work, or they can't work in the way that they used to. So this is a very good question, but very difficult to find an answer.
Great.
I'm just saying, I think I have answered the ones I have seen so far, but if there are more, I'll try to type in the chat. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Finda, for a very thorough response to those questions. Himanshu, I'd like to turn to you to pick up on some of what Finda has just been saying in terms of what their research is showing, measures that platforms have taken, and particularly talk to us in the context of Etsy. So what measures has Etsy in particular taken to mitigate the problems that workers are facing during the pandemic, and in particular your women sellers, which is as you said, 87% of your sellers around the world are women. So what is Etsy doing to both mitigate the problems that they face, but also build the resilience of these women? And how do you integrate your sellers' needs into the demands of your business? And I also wanted to pick up on a question that Helani raised a little bit earlier, which was, are platforms themselves offering help on matters like GST and business registration, taxes? I mean, to Kriti's points, if sellers are struggling with these kinds of issues to grow and expand their businesses, what is your view about platforms themselves providing these kinds of services? So over to you, Himanshu, to hear about Etsy.
Sure. So first of all, obviously these are like very difficult times for all of us, and our thoughts are with everybody who's affected by these particular situations across the world. Globally, there have been a lot of steps that we have taken. We have announced $5 million of offsite ad credits to our sellers. We have announced measures that will push off or delay the payments associated with the with paying their Etsy bills. So there are some of those measures that we have taken. But at the core of it, what drives people is really the demand. Actually, demand is something that is very important for our sellers and for our for people who are making these products, and that's where uh, what we have seen is that in April and in May, our the amount of business increased by almost 100% this year in these months compared to last year, which is a fairly big number for a company like Etsy, which is a $10 billion market cap company with such a big presence across the world. Having that kind of growth, and all of that growth is going directly to people who are making these products. So people like sellers like Kriti, she talked about her sales. What we did actually was not just for our sellers. Sellers benefited from it a lot, but also mobilized our sellers to get them together to make masks. So overnight, we saw in sometime in March, April, when wearing mask was recommended by a lot of specialists, and the traditional supply chains were disrupted. The big box, big factory manufacturing were disrupted. There were about 50,000 of our Etsy sellers from across the world that stepped in, who were making different things in textile, and they started to make masks, non-surgical masks for usage of people. And there were close to 130 million, or about I think it was 130 million or so masks that were produced by these sellers. We can confirm the numbers to you, but it was at a pretty big scale. So that was an interesting response, because that response was not just for the sellers, it also helped the buyers or the community in general, because while most of the traditional supply chains were struggling to meet the demand for masks, that was created by because of this particular reason, overnight, some of these very small sellers reacted and came together and started to really get these masks outside to the buyers. In terms of the last question, which somebody asked in the audience regarding what are the things that Etsy is doing, I actually want to contextualize Kriti's entrepreneurial story. We are talking about this is 2020, and we are discussing gig economy and freelance economy. Now go back to 2012. I don't think anybody was talking about these things in 2012, and that's when she started. And so a lot of other stories that you saw in the video as well are actually very entrepreneurial people who started by themselves with some support from their family members when Etsy did not have presence in India, physical office in India, an office doing enablements in India, which was established a couple of years back only. In last couple of years, we have made the process of starting up online very, very easy and very simple, with a lot of assistance from people that we work with. And so now to start up, you don't necessarily need to, take your husband's help or friend's help or anybody. You can get started online with an Etsy shop or even on social media. Like we have, when we help out people, then they can take those learnings to set up their business anywhere, in fact. So what we do is that we have onboarding associates that help them to sort of talk about the shipping and answer some simpler, easier sort of questions on GST as well, and the regulatory requirements. And then after that, we also work with our sellers. Once they are onboarded, then there are these shop success consultants who work with these sellers for help them to kind of create good shops with the interesting products that buyers would buy. So that's something that we have done, a very sort of an interesting onboarding structure. Now, obviously, as businesses scale, as Kriti has done, and a lot of other Etsy sellers have done over a period of time as well, the nature of the questions and the nature of issues that you are dealing with become complex over a period of time. honestly going to be there in different parts of the world, not just in India. And with that regard, also in last few months, we have started to make an attempt to get a lot of experts to talk about these issues. So in last month, we had somebody talk about exactly these issues around regulation on GST. We had somebody talk about shipping last year as well. We've had some very fruitful conversations with government in order to kind of think about simplifying them for our sellers, not just for our sellers, but all the gig economy workers and small sellers as well. So I think those conversations have been fruitful, and we would hopefully see a lot of those simplifications coming in times to come. So to some extent, we are kind of creating and providing access to some of these experts over the last couple of months, and we're going to do that a lot more in times to come. At the same point of time, as businesses grow and some of the issues could be very specific to them, which might only be sort of solved by seeking some professional help. One example that somebody told me, one of the Etsy sellers said that they crossed about 2 crore rupees of sales doing precious jewelry sitting out of their home. Like now, 2 crore is about 20 million rupees for the benefit of the larger audience. So they said that, what do I do? Like, what do we do? Now, that's a very different challenge for somebody. It's a precious metal, it's a specific industry, and it's a specific regulation that particular sector has, especially from an export point of view. And when businesses scale to that level, then there will be requirement to have to reach out to more professional help, and which might suit their specific needs. But at the same point of time, we have started to build a lot of these support groups in terms of getting access to the experts. Another thing that I would mention, what has started to happen a lot is a lot of our sellers who have solved these problems are now coming and forming communities. So we have we have a very strong community program. So when a seller does well or is a leader, they get other sellers together, and they get together. They used to get together in an in-person format. Now they get together virtually to discuss some of these issues and also share best practices. So we have this concept of Etsy teams and Etsy captains who are leading these community efforts. So this is not probably obviously going to be professional advice, but what we have found a lot of times is that this advice from peer sellers and from the community members is a lot more useful because it's practical, it's very immediately applicable to the scenario or a problem that a particular person is facing. And I do expect that those community efforts supported by us will take a larger shape and help problems, or help to solve the problems that Kriti just talked about.
Great, thank you so much for that very, I think, detailed description of the various kinds of measures. And you make a very good point, Himanshu, about as businesses grow and scale, their challenges also change. And at different points in the business trajectory, you need different kinds of support. And I think that's also an important message to take in terms of designing interventions that support female entrepreneurs, be they in the gig economy or otherwise as well. Aditi, I want to bring you into the conversation and ask you in particular, sort of more broadly speaking, what have you seen by way of examples of best practice relief measures that platforms have undertaken to support female gig workers? And, are you seeing the impact of COVID-19 on women in different kinds of platform work? How do you think both in terms of the impact on women in different kinds of platform work, but also how platforms are actually addressing some of these issues, both in terms of their own business models and in terms of improving the resilience of women workers on their platforms? What are you seeing, and how will this play out in the next few years to come?
Yeah, thank you for that, Selena. So I think what I'm going to echo a little bit of what Funda already said, which is that a lot of the policies that platforms have put up aren't necessarily gender specific. They are gender neutral in that they try and offer certain kinds of um, just it's mostly around financial inclusion, trying to offer people a certain amounts of money to tide over the time where they don't have work. And certain kinds of protections if they do get sick. And this is mostly the story with, again, on-demand work, similar set of companies that Funda was talking about. But when we start to look at, again, the point I made about women, working in sectors of the economy and very specific sectors of the economy, and just to take the example of domestic work, I mean, to think about what that means during the COVID times, right? We've had very restricted access in our households to who's been coming in, who's been going out. And part of what platforms have done to kind of intersect into that dynamic and into how we make that risk assessment is to offer all these protocols around, showing people's body temperature, trying to get the consumer to understand whether certain kinds of workers are safe to allow into their houses or not. And this is a kind, and I'm speaking not for the Etsy kind of work or for the cloud work kind of work. I'm very much talking about low to mid to high skilled service sector work, which is like, say, domestic work or delivery work. And here we've seen a lot of these metrics start to really define what a worker is. And often how these metrics are used is a function of a technology-based company that offers labor options to people, right? Which is that on an app, the only kind of signifier you see of a person who's walking into your house is what their body has been through, what their temperature is. And it's not difficult to imagine in the future these kind of bodily temperature readings to start to be extrapolated into fertility cycles, menstruation cycles. And there are a lot of cultural restrictions around women's work when it comes to specifically these two things. So if I think about the technological innovations that these platforms have created to help consumers in this time of trying to make a better judgments about who they're letting into their houses, be it through delivery or domestic work, we can extrapolate that and see that in the future, a lot of these can have very kind of discriminatory consequences. And often, these consequences don't have a human face behind them. Right? So you have a domestic worker or a female worker who is at the end of getting a lot of these automated decisions that are made about them. And this is kind of the main innovation of a lot of digital labor platforms, is something called algorithmic management. And I think Funda kind of pointed to some of that in the chat about some of those resources. But or if you look at research that's being done around people who work in companies and create some of these algorithmic systems, they often don't know what the consequences of their little bits of work are going to be. And often a lot of the consequences of this automated management really are seen at the time when that kind of decision gets taken. So in terms of trying to foresee how these sources of automation are going to affect women in the future, it's really very a blind course ahead. And there's another kind of thing, a development that's taken place over the last 2 or 3 months, which is that the COVID disruption has disrupted tech companies just as much as they've disrupted low-income households. So you've seen a lot of changes to the structures of tech companies, and I'm talking about on-demand companies, not Etsy or the marketplaces necessarily, but in a lot of Uber, Ola, Swiggy, Zomato, you've seen the operations teams, the teams that are on the ground supporting the delivery service staff, their jobs have been taken away, right? These are the first kind of rung of employees that have lost their jobs because companies need to kind of restrict and cut down and cull the companies so that they can be more profitable. And these on-ground field staff or operations teams or supply teams, like him and she was talking about for the Etsy example, they are the people who can give on-ground advice also, or can be a liaison between a platform and a worker. Now, if these people start to lose their jobs, that means those functions will start to be automated. And again, if you're a delivery worker and you don't have any kind of face to a company, you just have an app that you work for, these are the only people you can kind of really pick up the phone and try and call or meet at a center. So the more automation that we will see more automation, especially at the intersection of the platform and the worker or the service provider. And this has, far more implications for whether there'll be any ability to have, any kind of human engagement with the platform, and whether a worker has any ability to actually have a voice and negotiate something with someone. And these again are points that I'm making that aren't necessarily specific to women, but we know that women tend to have less ability to and have less time to form associations, to form collectives. They have less time because of their care work responsibilities to spend kind of learning these tactics of how to get the best out of platforms. So unless there's a lot of support given from platform companies, but also from governments who are seeing that this kind of work is important, then it's going to be like not a very great situation. And I just like to end with one point, and it was, I think, a question that was raised in the chat also, which is, are different states in India working through with platforms differently? And what we've seen over the last 2-3 months is that there have been states in India that have taken very proactive measures to partner with platform firms, especially when it comes to groceries and food and delivery, and the people who are allowed to be out on the streets of our cities were during the lockdown. So we have seen very proactive measures, MOUs created between platforms, MOUs that were created since 2014 around employment generation with certain states and platforms. So there is different states and governments are capable and willing to be part of a platform ecosystem very actively. And I think it's up to us as researchers and people who are thinking through these things to really push our public representatives to think through these questions a bit further, especially when it comes to women's economic empowerment. Back to you, Sabina.
Great. Thank you so much for that, Aditi. I think you raised a very important point about the discriminatory consequences of automated management of platforms. And I think it's really fundamental that not only do the people that are sort of writing these algorithms not know and unknowingly sort of building in discrimination, but there's also a complete lack of transparency on part of platforms, either willingly or intentionally or unintentionally, but there is a lack of transparency, which makes it particularly hard for regulators and policymakers to actually be able to legislate how these different evolving forms of work and these evolving business models actually affect workers. I also wanted to bring in one more thing that, this question about state level sort of different differentials across states in terms of platforms dealing with workers, or even regulations across states varying. I think it's important to bring in the fact that India is in the middle right now of the rewriting of its labor codes and basically harmonization and simplifying, what is a labyrinth of labor legislation, over 44 central and more than 100 different state pieces of legislation that they're state regulations that they're now kind of trying to boil down into 4 codes. And the Social Security Code in particular, for the first time ever, actually mentions gig workers, but kind of kicks the can down the road in terms of not really saying that gig workers are self-employed workers and therefore are responsible for their own social protection, or whether whether gig workers are considered to be employees and therefore holding platforms responsible for provision of certain protections. And so this is very much a debate that is currently underway in India right now. And it's interesting to me that, that policymakers are thinking about gig workers, but it's not clear whether this changing gig economy should actually deal with gig workers as a subset, or whether we need kind of more broad sweeping change in general that addresses informality, that addresses self-employment, that addresses women in the context of these broader regulatory changes. So, that's something for us to mull over, is, do we think of gig workers as a subset that need their own legislation, or should they be considered part of a broader universalization of the social protection architecture? That's one question. And then who's responsible for provision? To what extent do we hold platforms responsible and therefore legislate things like transparency in this automated management? Or do we sort of say, okay, this has to all be done through policymakers and regulation? So those are some of the questions that come to mind. We are now out of time, and I would just like to, I think, Jyoti Dar, I don't know if you're still on, but you had raised a very interesting point about platforms in Kashmir. And I think that adds a very unique dimension. And so I just wanted to give you a quick minute, if you're still on. Rather than me reading out your comment, I think it would be, you would do it justice. So if you're on and you just want to speak up and share your comment, and then we'll turn to Jillian for the closing. So Jyoti, are you on here? I can't really see. Perhaps not. Okay, Jyoti? Going once, going twice. Okay, well, Jyoti had a very interesting comment saying that she works with a lot of artisan women in Kashmir, and as a conflict lockdown zone for decades, they've faced all kinds of difficulties and negotiated economic crisis and access to markets with unstable earnings for very long periods of time. And there are several women artisans still on digital platforms, and several platforms have emerged from Kashmir which could serve as a lesson on for other women entrepreneurs on how to deal with these kinds of crises. Kriti, I just wanted to ask you for a very quick response on this idea that some platforms, certain platforms, particularly location-based platforms that, that sort of provide opportunities for women to kind of go into beauty and wellness or domestic work. Do you think that those platforms are reinforcing different kinds of gender norms and gender discrimination? What is your view on that? Kriti, you're muted. You're on mute. There you go.
Sorry. So, if I talk about a platform like Urban Clap, that's the one that provides services. So it has now become Urban Homes, and they've divided their whole urban, sort of the platform into different parts. So there's one Urban Beauty, Urban Homes. So now Urban Beauty, which actually, employs most of the women, in the beauty sector, in the massage, in going home services, that is now a completely separate category. I could say they've divided it into it's become like a separate entity of its own. And the other bit of it, which was the Urban Home, which employs mostly people like carpenters, your AC technicians, other technicians. So that is now a different entity. So I think gender-based, a lot of these platforms, they do really help women come up with, these platforms do give them an opportunity to really go out and do something really. So like in Hyderabad, I work with this NGO which does a lot of my stitching work. So what the NGO really does is that they go into these urban villages in Hyderabad, and they find a cluster of women, and they train the women to stitch. And then once that training is done, they actually open a small center inside the village. So actually these women don't really have to go too far out of their homes to work, and that center then employs them to actually do the stitching. So during the lockdown, in these past 2-3 months, these women were actually given sewing machines to take home, and all through the lockdown they were actually making masks. So like Himanshu mentioned that people were able to create masks overnight. So even in India, such a thing was happening. So a lot of these women who were given these sewing machines, they were actually running the small mask making business right from home. So you would think that a lockdown, really what would they be doing, the NGO, but they had actually created a real platform for them to really continue to earn their living. Yeah.
Thank you for that contribution, Kriti. And I'm conscious of the time, so now I would like to just turn to Gillian Dowie to, Gillian, you have the task of summarizing this very broad and rich discussion. So thank you again from my side, and Gillian, over to you.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Sabina. And thanks to all of the speakers and everybody who submitted questions and participated in this webinar. I think these are really important conversations to be having right now, keeping our attention really firmly on how COVID-19 is impacting women working through platforms and women working obviously in the broader economy. Some common threads today, I'll do this very quickly, we're obviously out of time. Some common threads have been the kind of the differences in the types of platforms and how important that is when we're talking about platforms and doing research in this space. We've talked a lot about the policies that platforms themselves, particularly on-demand platforms, have been sort of extending to workers during this time to try to overcome some of the challenges that this crisis has caused. But those are often not gender specific, and they are often, they take into account maybe a bit more the concerns of consumers over other parties. We have heard about the fundamental issues related to access. In India, the digital economy is highly male dominated, mirroring the offline economy. So at this point, it hasn't really created the kind of structural change that may allow women to get better opportunities. And I think that this is also linked, at least in part, to women's care responsibilities, which has come up quite a few times. Women primarily take on care responsibilities, and their ability to invest time and be available to the same degree as men is obviously impacted by that. And this has been particularly challenging during the pandemic. And care and time poverty also contribute to women's inability to come together and learn from collective experiences, as Aditi mentioned, and create sort of collectives that have been really, really powerful in other places in gaining rights for gig workers. And also that there is a data gap. There's a data gap on women in the digital economy. As we said, if there's no indication that the structures of the labor market are being loosened and opened up to women online, we need a better understanding of how women are working through platforms, what kinds of policies can facilitate those kinds of shifts, what kinds of initiatives and policies can increase women's access to more lucrative, maybe knowledge-based work, for example. All of this is still needed. We need to understand a little bit better. And as the pandemic goes on and we begin to see the kinds of economic consequences that may last a very long time, we need to start thinking more about how technology and the digital economy can grow in a way that does create new jobs and that creates new opportunities for people that have lost other forms of income in this time, and that's not going to come back in the near future. And how the benefits from these kinds of jobs can be spread more equally and inclusively, and what are the roles for platforms, policymakers, and workers in governing this kind of work? What can everybody do collectively, and how can this better reflect the needs of everybody involved? So this has been an excellent webinar. I think that the level of participation, the number of questions shows a really large and growing interest in this topic. With all of the speculation about more and more jobs being pushed online in the post-COVID world, I think we're all connecting at the right time. The Women Working Gig Economy Research Initiative that I talked about in the beginning does have plans to share more online of the work that they're generating and doing more of these kinds of webinars to continue to encourage this sort of discussion and connect with new people. And so yeah, keep your eyes open for that, and let's look for more opportunities to connect. And yeah, thank you again to Sabina and the organizers and everybody online. Have a great day. Sabina?
Great. Thank you all very much. Thank you to our speakers and all the participants. And Kriti, thank you for being so brave to share your story. And of course, my Just Jobs Network team, particularly Stefan, for helping put this webinar together, and IDRC for all your support. Thank you all. Have a great afternoon.